Good afternoon, welcome back. Good afternoon to those who are here in presence in the room and those who are online. Welcome back, and let's start the seventh session of this work, of this conference. I'm very glad to present our speaker, Jeff Anderson, who taught philosophy at 4 different universities over the course of his career. He retired as chair of philosophy and religion at the University of North Texas, and presently he teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale on a part-time basis. He's the author of many publications. There's a list of 5 books, editor of 7 more, and he's published numerous articles and chapters. And he has lectured around the world, Finland, Colombia, China, Germany. We are very happy, and the title of his paper and his chapter in the handbook is Philosophy as a Way of Life, American Transcendentalism. Thank you very much, Douglas, and the stage is yours, so please.
Thank you. Are you ready for me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Well, I want to apologize in advance. I can't stay for Richard's talk because I have to go teach a class, but I do know Richard's work well and certainly know the pragmatists. I'm going to try to give a quick overview of American Transcendentalist thought as a philosophy as a way of life. And I'm simply going to read because it'll be clear, I think, that way. And then if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer. So the New England Transcendentalist movement was, I think, essentially about philosophy as a way of life. Not long before Bertrand Russell was excluding ethics as a topic with which philosophy should be concerned, the Transcendentalists were looking for ways to improve their lives. Opening education to new methods and new students, experimenting with communal living, resisting the practice of slavery, and providing different life opportunities for women. Like much post-Socratic philosophy, they reflected upon and challenged conventions, norms, and they willingly experimented with alternative ways of living. Because of their focus on the conduct of life, the Transcendentalists have, by and large, especially in the 20th century, been dismissed as non-philosophers. They were often ridiculed in their time and have since been mostly neglected by professional philosophy. In what follows, I want to focus on brief overviews of 3 representative thinkers of the Transcendentalist movement: Margaret Fuller, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry Thoreau, who are perhaps the best known figures. Some scholars like to question whether these 3 were card-carrying transcendentalists for various reasons. But the movement was broad and fluid, and under any general vision of the movement, these 3 were the central and most representative figures. Henry Thoreau, whose work is not generally taught in philosophy courses, spoke directly to the question of philosophy as both a care for wisdom and as a way of conducting one's life. In his well-known book, Walden, he noted, "There are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers. Yet it is admirable to profess because it was once admirable to live. To be a philosopher is not merely to have subtle thoughts, nor even to found a school, but so to love wisdom as to live according to its dictates, a life of simplicity, independence, magnanimity, and trust. It is to solve the problems of life, not only theoretically, but practically." Thoreau echoes Socrates and the post-Socratics and certainly foreshadows the pragmatic outlooks of William James and John Dewey. And of course, William James grew up in a family that was close to Emerson and Thoreau. Walden's opening 2 chapters are an exercise in philosophy as a way of life, or living philosophically. Thoreau's aim was to conduct a personal experiment in living, to test cultural norms, and to see by experience what works and what doesn't. He was, in this sense, I think, a Socratic thinker, one who is an ongoing learner and one who experimented with rather than dogmatically accepted cultural nomoi. But he was one who also had the courage to act, a requirement that Plato attended to in the Republic. Thoreau turned the idea of economics from money, property, and accounting, which he had studied at Harvard, to an accounting of one's life. How shall we human animals conduct our lives on earth, given the fact that we are finite and fallible? Thoreau would have us pursue our own way and live philosophically, following the dictates of what wisdom we can find and remaining open to learning across all of our years. Thoreau was a provocateur, and in almost all of his writings, from Walden to Civil Disobedience to his late essays, Wild Apples and Walking, Thoreau aimed to awaken us to the possibility of living philosophically. He did not believe our schooling did as much to awaken us as it might. And I quote, "That economy of living which is synonymous with philosophy is not even sincerely professed in our colleges." I think that remains clearly true today. As John Dewey later noted, much of our best learning occurs outside of schooling. It has been my experience that when there are cultural crises, such as wars and civil rights movements, some professors return to Thoreau's version of economy. But on the whole, higher education has become more and more mechanical, a simple vehicle for entering the world of career and money in some fashion. Whenever a culture turns education into this sort of mercenary activity, it remains asleep and lives in its own dogmatic slumbers. It is perhaps no surprise then that cheating has become a norm in American higher education. In short then, Thoreau asks about the actual cost-benefit analysis of our lives, of acquiring more and more stuff. In economy, Thoreau directly challenges the notion that our account ledger is the sole mark of our success in living. His awakening call points to some obvious ills of American culture. He asks to what extent our accumulation of land, material goods, and wealth comes down to own us more than we own them. He trades on the ambiguity of the word own. On the one hand, we are said to own when we have a legal document, such as a deed or a title. On the other side, we own something when we make it ours, when we invest our being in it. And it's in the latter sense that we own our creations, our life decisions, and our promises. Thoreau intimates that legal ownership is not worth having if we don't own something in the latter sense. And in the worst cases, our legal ownings begin to prevent us from being alive and awake. Houses, land, cars, clothing, and the rest consume our time, energy, and wealth. They deaden our daily existence. So instead of living with and for what we own, making it ours, what we own takes us away from who we are and, as importantly, who we would like to become. This is perhaps the most important reason for experimenting with simplicity and what Thoreau calls voluntary poverty. I see young men, Thoreau says, my townsmen, whose misfortune it is to have inherited farms, houses, barns, cattle, and farming tools, for these are more easily acquired than got rid of. The cost, Thoreau argues, is the loss of self-knowledge and the freedom to consider one's own possibilities. The inheritors become, he says, so occupied with factitious cares and superfluously coarse labors of life that its finer fruits cannot be plucked by them. I cannot think of a better description of the cause of what we generically describe as a midlife crisis, an awakening to our finitude and to the meaninglessness of so much of what we spend our lives doing. When we give into the weight of social norms, we become desperate. He says what is called resignation is confirmed desperation, and it is a characteristic of wisdom not to do desperate things. From Thoreau's angle of vision, such resignation is not a necessity of life. We have the ability, if not the courage, to awaken and to seek wisdom in life. It is never too late, he says, to give up our prejudices. Acquisitiveness is a fact of our capitalist culture, but it is not a human necessity. Nor, for Thoreau, is it a mark of wisdom or life success, but quite the reverse. For a person, he says, is rich in proportion to the number of things which they can afford to let alone. Thoreau's philosophy as a way of life asks us to become learners and lovers of wisdom. He asks us to awaken to our actual conditions as human animals, our finitude, our creative abilities and desires, our own selves, and again, so to love wisdom as to live according to its dictates. Even more than in Thoreau's time, we have become a culture of followers, We follow more than we act for ourselves and through ourselves. We are mesmerized by those who do act and create, and often those we follow are not the wise, but the self-interested, the acquisitive, those of accidental wealth and beauty. It is the luxurious and dissipated, Thoreau says, who set the fashions which we heard so diligently follow. If we follow buffoons, our lives become mere sub-buffoonery. This is worrisomely apparent in our current American politics. In considering Thoreau's message regarding the economy, it is important to remember that we are not to be paralyzed by our learning, but to use our learning at every stage as a catalyst for our own creation. We must experimentally act as Thoreau did at Walden Pond to see what works. His outlook is an effective harbinger of the pragmatic philosophy that was born in the ensuing generation of American culture. In questioning the importance of his own Harvard education, Thoreau asks, how could youth better learn to live than by at once trying the experiment of living? Methinks, he said, it would exercise their minds as much as mathematics. So in closing the brief remarks on Thoreau, I'd like to avoid one common misconception. Thoreau did not want others to live or try his way of living. I would not have anyone who says adopt my mode of living on any account. We need each of us to awaken and experiment on our own in whatever culture, time, and history we find ourselves. Thoreau put in an early claim for the importance of diversity of human animals. I desire, he said, that there be as many different persons in the world as possible, but I would have each one be very careful to find out and pursue his own way, and not his father's, his mother's, or his neighbor's instead. If there was anyone who had had to find out and pursue their own way amongst the Transcendentalists, it was Margaret Fuller. Fuller's work is taught even less than Thoreau's in philosophy courses, and generally it's taught less than any of the other major Transcendentalists. Being a woman of the 19th century, she didn't have the benefit of a Harvard education. She didn't have the freedom to write and publish as a woman, nor the respect of her culture for her intelligence, wit, and her writerly talents. She was extremely well educated, in part because her father insisted on her learning, and in part because she was a natural learner aiming to improve herself in whatever way she could. She never described herself as a philosopher, though she was well acquainted with Plato and Spinoza, but she was quite clearly a philosopher in the way that Thoreau described. Philosophy was for her, from her first and earliest youthful reflections, a way of life. Though I will focus on her signature writing, Woman in the 19th Century, I think it is important to see this work as the culmination of a life of reflection and self-discovery that embodies her awakening to her own possibilities. And to this end, I would note a few biographical experiences that led her in this direction. By the time she was 15, Fuller had rejected most religious dogma because it did not fit with her classical training and her own experience. Nevertheless, she studied the Harvard Divinity School's curriculum with her friend James Freeman Clark, who was enrolled in the Divinity School. Because she was a woman, of course, she could not enroll, but she did, over the course of this study, teach herself German in the process so that she could read Schiller, Novalis, and Goethe. Within a year of her study, she became a first-rate translator, and that later led to other scholarly work for her. Not drawing any marriage proposals, she chose what she called self-dependency, turned away from churches, and continued to live philosophically, reflectively, and thoughtfully. As her biographer Megan Marshall notes, she was drawn to philosophy, which she wrote, quoting Novalis, is peculiarly homesickness and overmastering desire to be at home. There's no question that she spent most of her life trying to learn how to be at home in a man's world, and suggested that her own at-homeness likely required a change in the cultural world in which she found herself. Philosophy for her was neither system building nor bare logical analysis. It was an ongoing intellectual and emotional quest to find her way in the world. At age 25, Fuller began to publish, writing 3 literary essays for American Monthly Magazine. At 27, she began her brief stint as a teacher of young women. And at every turn, Fuller noted the secondary status of women, and she began her own modes of resistance. Her erudition and articulate conversation won her an invitation to the Transcendental Club, a loose association of young Boston area thinkers who were exploring cultural change in a variety of arenas. When confronted with the usual negative descriptions of transcendentalism, she replied that a transcendentalist is simply an active mind, frequently busy with large topics. And she told friends she was honored by the friendship of such men as Mr. Emerson, Mr. Ripley, and Mr. Alcott. Fuller remained on a quest to find out who she could become. She was flattered to be included by renegade thinkers of note in Boston, but that was not enough. What troubled her most, Marshall notes, were the real limits imposed upon her sex, both by external prohibitions on schooling and employment, and by the self-restraint that women learned and internalized. Thus, her battle for life and for feeling at home took place on two fronts: against the formal legal barriers that pervaded New England culture, and against the cultural acquiescence of most women to their domination. She used two platforms to wage her cultural battles. With Emerson, she founded the journal The Dial, open to the young transcendentalists, where they could voice their outlooks, however controversial, in both poetry and prose. Fuller published her seminal essay, The Great Lawsuit, Man versus Men, Woman versus Women, in this journal. And this essay laid the groundwork for women in the 19th century. The second platform was a women's group that Fuller founded and led that went by the name of Conversations. The meetings of this group over several years created a space where women could safely explore what was difficult or inadequate in their lives, a space where Fuller hoped they could begin to grow. And then in 1845, Fuller published Woman in the 19th Century. In its preface, she argued about men and women that the development of the one cannot be affected without that of the other. My highest wish, she wrote, was that this truth could be distinctly and rationally apprehended, and the conditions of life and freedom recognized as the same for the daughters and the sons of time. The book sold well and was both cherished and ridiculed. It won Fuller enough notoriety as a writer and thinker to open other doors. In it, she laid the foundation for the development of women's rights and feminism in the United States. Living philosophically was for Fuller to live honestly and openly. When writing as a journalist and columnist for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, she always asked herself two questions, Greeley noticed. One, is it the truth? And two, is it such as the public should know? Much like post-Socratics, she chose to use experiential truths as an antidote to immoral and outmoded cultural practices and habits. The overarching claim of the book is that women as well as men should be allowed and enabled to grow intellectually and to live freely. To enact such changes, she argued, women should act without the aid of men. As she saw it, even well-intentioned men were too deeply rooted in the misogynist habits to be useful. Like W.E.B. Du Bois after her, she saw that a life of oppression offered a wider range of experiential vision. Men, she believed, could not experientially understand what women's lives were actually like. So taking a page from Socrates, she also argued that the liberation of women would be good for both men and women. Men would be liberated from their immoral habits of oppressing and enslaving women, and therefore would become better persons. Fuller explored a number of avenues to describe women's lives and how they might be improved. She made clear that marriage was, for the most part, legalized slavery. As Marshall states, in truth, a woman had fewer rights when married than when single, at least in the US. She gave up all her property to her husband, forfeited her right to appear in court to raise her children in the event of divorce, and became a possession, or at best, an adopted child in her husband's household. Fuller wrote of various cases in which women's lives were tragically and needlessly ruined in this context. And she offered different possible versions of marriage in which the spouses might be on an equal footing and in which they were intellectual, emotional, and social partners. She advocated for women to be allowed and enabled to be full property owners, to be politically engaged, and to be equally educated. In short, Fuller undertook to expose and offer remedies for the legal and cultural mistreatment of women on all fronts. She wrote about topics that were not supposed to be mentioned in public. For example, she visited imprisoned prostitutes and discussed the cultural conditions that led to their destitute lives. She argued that all human animals live their lives on a gender spectrum. Each of us, she maintained, have both masculine and feminine qualities in different degrees. There was for her no pure man nor pure woman. Living philosophically for Margaret Fuller began as a personal endeavor and culminated in a thoughtful and articulate critique of the culture that consistently tried to thwart her development and the self-reliance of all women. So it's no surprise that her writing inspired the likes of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In the end, Fuller lived philosophically as a writer, teacher, and speaker. She was a scholar and an original thinker, and yet she is almost never considered to be a philosopher by the 20th century profession, and her works are seldom taught in philosophy courses worldwide. So to a lesser extent, the same was true for, obviously for Thoreau, but also for her friend and mentor, Waldo Emerson. Now, Emerson has been attacked as a non-philosopher for a variety of reasons, both in his day and at present. He is said to have no system and no logic, and he is considered to be too literary and too poetic. Nevertheless, on the model of Plato and Socrates, Emerson did live philosophically and wrote about the conduct of life from his earliest essays to his final thoughts. The very titles of his later collections of essays reveal this much: Society and Solitude, Representative Men, and the Conduct of Life. It's difficult to choose one work to illustrate Emerson's focus on philosophy as a way of life, because it was a central feature of nearly everything he wrote. In an early essay entitled Doctrine of the Soul, he wrote that philosophy has been unable to satisfy us that we can do no more than others. In all its experiments, there has always remained, in the last analysis, a residuum which it could not resolve. So in contrast to A.J. Ayer, who carelessly and arrogantly predicted that philosophy would have answered all its questions by the year 2000, Emerson argued that the door is always open for a person thinking. Philosophy, understood as a way of conducting one's life, is an ongoing human endeavor. And in passing, I would mention that I think it's fundamentally incorrect to think that he had neither a logic nor a system. He had a very well-developed, what we might call metaphysics these days, but an open metaphysics, not the closed deductive sort. Emerson consistently argued for the importance of self-reliance, not as a crass, rugged individualism, but as keeping our active thinking alive as the world changes around us. As later for William James, for Emerson, life is in the transitions. Significantly, Emerson did not reject the importance of studying the history of thought and cultural habits. They can inspire us to our own ends and help us locate ourselves in the cosmos. But we should not be smothered by history and tradition and fall asleep to the world under their weight. Thinking for oneself is not a rejection of the thought of others, but a measured and reflective response to what is already written. This is why philosophy was conversational for the Greeks, not a winner-takes-all competition, but a genuine conversation among friends aimed at truths experiential and theoretical. For Emerson, every generation must remain new and seek its own truths. And I put those truths in quotes at that point because his version of truth is very similar to what follows in the pragmatic tradition. But in Emerson's way of putting it, if I have renounced the search for truth, if I have come into the port of some pretending dogmatism, some new church or some old church, some Schelling or cuisine, I have died to all use of these new events that are born out of prolific time into multitude of life every hour. So like Thoreau, after him, Emerson was concerned that we not die spiritually and intellectually before our actual death. Living philosophically meant for him to be awake and alive to the world around us. It might be important to read Hegel's thought carefully, but it might be equally important not to be a Hegelian, not to be dogmatically slavish to his thought. In his essay, The American Scholar, Emerson states that the world is his who can see through its pretension. But this kind of perception, Emerson suggests, requires more than a narrow intellectual reasoning. It requires experience. Otherwise, instead of a person thinking, we become what he called the bookworm. Our philosophical education resides not only in reading Plato and Hegel, but in the education we receive from things, from the frame of the world, its order. These are the theme of poetry and the wonder of philosophy. In writing about Plato as a representative philosopher, he wrote that a philosopher must be more than a philosopher. And in his essay, Experience, Emerson urges readers to live in what he called the midworld, in a balance between intellectual abstractions and ideals and the everyday affairs of animal existence. Everything good, he says, is on the highway. The middle region of our being is the temperate zone. We climb into the realm of pure geometry and lifeless science, or sink into that of sensation. Between these extremes is the equator of life, of thought, of spirit and poetry, the narrow belt. Thus, in describing Plato as Socratic, Emerson says, the balanced soul came. If he made transcendental distinctions, he fortified himself by drawing all his illustrations from sources disdained by orators and polite conversers, from mares and puppies, pitchers and soup ladles, cooks and criers, the shop supporters, horse doctors, butchers, and fishmongers. In looking across Emerson's essays, we find everything from spiritual laws in the oversoul to manners, gifts, and politics. Living philosophically should be expansive and inclusive, not narrow and closed. As for Thoreau, Emerson did not ask us to imitate his life. Each of us establishes an arc that someone else's thought must complete. As for Fuller and Thoreau, Emerson directs us to explore who we are, to live both theoretically and philosophically. The central thrust of his most trenchant essay, such as the Divinity School Address, is that we need to account for ourselves, that religion is about one's own experiences and not about the dogmas of others' experiences. This is why Emerson and Transcendentalism in general were seen as dangerous to their contemporary society. Asking people to think and experience for themselves will always be a challenge to establish orders, social habits, and cultural traditions. Not because these are necessarily going to be destroyed, but because their pretensions will be exposed, and in consequence, they might be destroyed. I said at the closing, I believe American Transcendentalism was essentially concerned with living philosophically, with the pursuit of truth, self-knowledge, social awareness, and with a melioristic attitude that one could contribute to the betterment of human existence. The movement is well represented by Emerson, Fuller, and Thoreau, and yet it was much more than these three representatives. There were educational experiments by Elizabeth Peabody, Orphic sayings and communal experiments of Bronson Alcott, and the readings of German literature with Henry Hedge, and much more. But at the core of all was the thought that we have the ability to think and live philosophically. And this requires an awakening from whatever cultural oppressions and restraints we allow to affect us. Requires self-trust and self-knowledge that allows us to be creative readers rather than social media followers. The Socratic message they gave has as much relevance and importance to our present situation as it did in the 1830s and 40s. That's it.
Thank you very much for this highly interesting paper and for being that precise. So we have time for at least three questions, either both in presence and remotely. Is somebody who want alive?
Hey Doug, it's Eli Kramer and Laura Mueller's here, so there's a little SIU contingent in the corner. My question for you, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the what of the classics Fuller, Emerson, and Thoreau had read, and what you think were more influential. For this particular audience who's less familiar with American philosophy, some of those threads might be helpful, and could be refreshing. Oh yeah, Laura.
I'm just gonna add to that real quick because it's related to Eli's question. Or if you could also speak of whether or not Fuller was influenced by any of the modernist women, such as Margaret Cavendish or Mary Estelle, who were also talking about the same kinds of things, but restrictions of women, overcoming custom, and so on and so forth.
Briefly, I'll try to answer those. Emerson was clearly influenced by the German Romantics, as was Fuller. Hegel and Schelling, I think, were most important for Emerson, probably Schelling most important. For Thoreau, it was the post-Socratics. And I should have mentioned, Plato was the representative thinker for Emerson. But for Thoreau, it was the post-Socratics, and I've written more extensively about his relationship to the Cynics in particular. He appreciated the idea that one could live simply and also have cultural effects in living simply. For Margaret Fuller, the main, certainly Wollstonecraft and the contemporaries around her, de Staël, George Sand, and so forth, were heavily influential. She went to meet Sand over in France not long before she died. I don't know that she was familiar with Cavendish and Estelle. I'm not sure their works were all that available to her at that time. When I see what she was reading in Spinoza and Descartes, I don't see the connection to either Cavendish or Estelle there, though she certainly would have appreciated what they were doing.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, I can't see, but I don't see if it's anybody.
Oh, there's one. I think about.
Oh, David, yeah. David, about you can ask a question, please. We're listening.
Okay, hi there. That was great. I just wanted to question, in a way, it's a bigger question that I think you raised, and I know it's to do with your work. A lot of the time we're looking at periods through time, but one of the things I get from the Transcendentalists, which I know you've done in your other work, is, Europe and America as place. Philosophy is a way of life, like where we do it. I wonder if there's any comment. I know that you've done work on that, but is there a bigger problem in the way we are always, well, Hadot and Foucault do it? We look back rather than the European-American tension, the emergence of what you might call a unique set of philosophies. So that's, I don't know if it's a valuable question, but it's just what came to mind with the way Thoreau, Emerson, Fuller have informed 20th century, whether it's Bugby or whatever you want to call the isms, but is there something about place, wilderness, and home that we miss when we do philosophy as a way of life through looking at the past rather than through different places?
I would say that for the Transcendentalists, both are important.
Yeah.
But certainly, yes, places, I didn't mention physical place as much as cultural environment, but cultural environment for them would include physical space and place. And even within the United States, for example, you get very different philosophical livings in different places. The South has a very different history than the Northeast. And I think they were all attentive to that. Emerson, certainly in the American Scholar, points to it. He's focusing on something particular about the US versus England or versus Europe at that time. But I think in the larger picture, thinking about place is as crucial, and certainly, as you point out, was for Henry Bugby. And Bugby is following Thoreau in that practice of, where. So, maybe the best place to go is Thoreau's second chapter of Walden, Where I Lived and What I Lived For, where the place and the making of the place and the environment becomes part of the story of living philosophically. It's not just about what I think. It's not about just how I treat other people, but how I deal with the environment that I'm in physically. And the rest of the Walden book incorporates a lot of that. My library, what do I read? The animals around me that become my friends or are not my friends, and then to the actual physical landscape, the pond, and so forth. So I think that's a feature, certainly for Emerson and Thoreau. And in Fuller, it shows up in the fact that she lived different places within New England, New York, and then eventually over in Italy and Europe. And she has remarkable thought about the way the places we're in begin to influence how we think and how we live. She doesn't thematize it, she describes it. Yeah, so I think that's an important addendum to the way that the Transcendentalists were thinking about how we think about the world and how to live.
Thanks.
And I should say that there's a beautiful place behind you. I don't know whether that's a.
Oh, sorry, I'm in Anglesey, just off the edge of Britain and towards Ireland. Yeah, so that you can see, and I'm familiar with some of your work, and I think there's something to be said about the spatial shifts of Europe and America, which can get missed in the temporal mode that Foucault brings. You know, there's always a past to move from into the new, and the problem of the new world and destruction of American wilderness, or whatever you want to look at it. Anyway, thanks,
Yeah, thank you for the question.
We have one last question, and then, yeah, we have time for the last one. Pedro, on your left.
Thank you, Douglas, for this wonderful presentation. So, quick question. Do you see any resemblance or common ground between Emersonian perfectionism as theorized by Stanley Cavell and the philosophy as a way of life, the approach, the model philosophy as a way of life in the wake of Adorno's and Foucault's work? Do you see any common ground and resemblance between these two tendencies, these philosophical works? Thank you.
I think I heard the question. I'm not entirely sure. So I'm going to, you asked about Cavell's work, later work, and I guess it was post-war philosophy, post-World War II philosophy. Maybe I missed that.
Stanley Cavell, I'm not familiar if you know this concept of Stanley Cavell that he develops in a couple of books. Emersonian perfectionism, or moral perfectionism, conditions of handsome, sea of words, and other words. So I want to know if you can see any resemblance between Emersonian perfectionism, as theorized by Stanley Cavell, and philosophy as a way of life, as an approach theorized by Pierre Hadot.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading and writing about Emerson and Thoreau long before I ran into and read Stanley Cavell's work. And I do think I mean, obviously Cavell is drawing on primarily some later essays in Emerson. And his style is to dig into a particular essay and turn it into something that he himself is thinking about, which I think is a very Emersonian practice. And in that sense, there's a clear line of connection. My own thinking about the perfectionism is that that's a little overdone. It's more Cavell in a way than it either was for Fuller or Emerson, although he's drawing on their discussions of that issue. I think both of them were, at least in practice, more melioristic than perfectionist. They were, I think they foreshadowed the pragmatists more than, I don't want to just call it linguistic analysis with Cavell, but more than just intellectual readership of texts and sort of uncoverings from the texts, the sort of thing that Rorty later began to talk about. So the answer is yes, I see a clear connection. I think Cavell's time and place is quite different. He's coming out of the history of the linguistic turn in philosophy. He's focusing on literature and the arts and the ways that we can think about those things. And that's all very Emersonian in a way. And I certainly don't reject it. I think on the whole, if I were to look at a comparison, it misses a lot of the other things that are going on in the Transcendentalist movement. Dealing with nature, dealing with the world at large. So I have some, you know, as a scholar, I have some intellectual quarrels with Cavell over the readings of the texts. But as a thinking about living philosophically, I mean, Cavell is offering us some opportunities to reflect on that are quite different than the ways I would do it. And I think that's really important work. And I think that I think he introduced to some European thinkers who were interested this tradition that otherwise would not have been introduced to the world. So I take that to also be very valuable.
Thank you very much.